August 18th, 2010, Leduc County, Alberta. While staying with her infant son and a friend at a motel, 20-year-old Amber Tuccaro decides to hitchhike to Edmonton. She never returns. And 2 years later, Amber's skeletal remains are discovered in a farmer's field. Police release audio of a recording from Amber's cell phone in which she can be heard conversing with a male driver on the very night of her disappearance. She's fearful he's taking her to a remote area. And despite a public plea for information, the man's voice was never positively identified. After that, the trail went cold.
Hello everyone, and welcome to the latest episode of The Trail Went Cold. I'm your host Robin Warder, and today we are going to be covering two cold cases from my home country of Canada, the 2010 disappearance and murder of Amber Tuccaro, and the 2011 murder of Jolene Cote. That voice you just heard narrate our intro was Ben Ham, the host of a podcast called The Secret Room, and stay tuned because I will be providing more information about this show and playing a promo for it later this episode. These two cases took place just over 1 year apart in relatively close proximity to the city of Edmonton, the capital of the province of Alberta. The idea for this episode came about when Kelly Campbell, one of the previous winners of our Trail Went Cold listener voiceover contest, requested I cover the Jolene Cote murder. However, since the Royal Canadian Mounted Police has been very secretive about many details of the investigation, the case probably does not have enough material for an entire episode. So my solution was to combine Jolene's story with the murder of Amber Tuccaro, a young Indigenous woman who went missing in 2010 before her skeletal remains were discovered 2 years later. As you might know, the mishandling of cases involving missing and murdered Indigenous women is a major issue up here in Canada, and Amber's story was no exception. The case has since obtained some extra exposure because of the release of some disturbing audio from Amber's cell phone, as a conversation was recorded between her and an unidentified male who gave her a ride. It seems likely that these are some of the last moments of Amber's life before she was murdered, and even though the voice of her probable killer has been released publicly, he is yet to be identified. Aside from the fact that they both took place in Alberta within approximately 60 kilometers of each other, there's nothing to suggest that the murders of Amber Tuccaro and Jolene Cote are connected, but they both deserve attention. I will start off the episode by covering Amber's story before I move on to Jolene's, and then I will provide my analysis on both these cases. However, before we get started, just a quick reminder that The Trail Went Cold is a weekly podcast, which is currently available for download on several platforms, including iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play Music, and Spotify. So if you like this podcast, be sure to subscribe to it, and please leave us a rating or review on any of those sites to help spread the word and garner us more exposure. The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so if you would like to learn how to support the show, please visit our page at patreon.com/thetrailwentcold. For as little as $1 a month, you can garner access to exclusive rewards, which may include stickers and thank you cards, early access to episodes, and bonus content. So with all that out of the way, let us now start off by exploring the unsolved murder of Amber Tuccaro. Our first story begins in Alberta, Canada in 2010. Our first central figure is a 20-year-old Indigenous woman named Amber Alyssa Tuccaro, a member of the Mikisew Cree First Nation who grew up in Fort Chipewyan. Amber has a 14-month-old son named Jacob, and they are currently living together in Fort McMurray with Amber's mother, Vivian Tuccaro, who often goes by the name Tootsie. On August 17th, Amber, Jacob, and another female friend of hers left on a trip to Edmonton. After arriving at Edmonton International Airport, they decided to save money by staying at a motel in Nisku, an industrial park located in Leduc County, nearly 30 kilometers south of Edmonton. They would spend the day in Nisku, but by the time evening hit, Amber decided she wanted to go into the city to meet another friend of hers. So she left Jacob in the company of her friend at the motel in order to hitchhike to Edmonton. Amber left sometime between 7:30 and 8 p.m., but unfortunately, she never returned. When Amber did not show up by the following morning, her friend got in touch with Tootsie Tuccaro, who subsequently contacted the Leduc detachment of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police to report her daughter missing. Tootsie would become frustrated by the lack of action by the RCMP, who initially said that Amber was probably just out partying and would turn up eventually. But of course, Tootsie did not believe Amber would be irresponsible enough to abandon her infant son. After 1 month passed, Tootsie was shocked to learn that Amber's name had been removed from the RCMP's missing persons list, even though she had been told this would not happen unless there was confirmation that Amber was still alive. The RCMP claimed they had heard from someone who saw Amber, and one of their media relations officers was quoted by the media as saying, "We don't have any reason to believe she is in any danger. We know that she is in the Edmonton area." Well, this alleged sighting was not 100% verified, so Tootsie fought to get her daughter's name placed back on the missing persons list. She was given the runaround and had to go through a lot of bureaucratic red tape, so an entire month passed before Amber was added to the list again. If that wasn't enough, Tootsie learned that Amber's personal belongings, which were left behind in her motel room in Nisku, were collected by the police. Instead of keeping them as potential evidence, or returning them to Amber's family, the belongings were destroyed after Amber's name was taken off the list. The investigation hit a complete standstill, and Tootsie would gain full custody of Jacob in order to raise him in Amber's absence. However, Amber's case was eventually transferred to Project CARE, a unit of the RCMP which investigates cases of vulnerable at-risk missing persons in Alberta, and shortly after the 2-year anniversary of her disappearance, there would be a shocking revelation. On August 28, 2012, CARE held a press conference in which they played a 1-minute excerpt of a recording of a cell phone conversation Amber had on the night she went missing. While inside a vehicle, Amber received a call from her brother, Paul Tuccaro, who was being held in a correctional facility called the Edmonton Remand Center at that time. Since the facility had a policy to record all outgoing calls from inmates, the entire conversation between Paul and Amber was recorded, and it happened to capture some exchanges between Amber and an unidentified male who had presumably picked her up hitchhiking. The entire recording lasted 17 minutes, but only 61 seconds have ever been released publicly, and it features Amber expressing concern that the driver is not heading in the direction of the city. Here is the actual audio.
Where are we by?
We're just heading south of Beaumont, or north of Beaumont.
We're heading north to Beaumont. Yo, where are we going? No, this is a... Are you f***ing kidding me? You better not be taking me anywhere I don't want to go. I want to go into the city. Jeez. Yo, we're not going into the city, are we?
We're going.
No, we're not.
Yes.
Then where the f*** are these roads going to?
50th Street.
50th Street. Are you sure?
Absolutely.
Yo, where are we going?
50th Street.
50th Street?
50th Street.
East, right?
East.
Over town.
Bravo.
Bravo.
So as you can hear from the conversation, the male driver initially says they're heading south past the town of Beaumont, but then corrects himself and says he's heading north, since north is the direction you're supposed to be heading when you drive from Nisku to Edmonton. As Amber becomes gradually more agitated, the man tells her they are driving east on some back roads, which are supposed to lead to 50th Street, which connects Beaumont to Edmonton. The last part of the audio is muffled, but it almost sounds like Amber is telling the man to pull over before the call cuts off. Based on the exchanges on the recording, Police believe that the man was driving Amber southeast of Nisku into rural Leduc County. Police hoped that by releasing this audio to the public and posting it on the Project Care website, someone might recognize this man's voice and come forward. This marked the first time in their history that the RCMP had ever publicly released an audio recording connected to a homicide investigation. While remarkably, there would be a major development only 4 days later. On September 1st, a skull and some other skeletal remains were discovered by horseback riders in a farmer's field in Leduc County near Beaumont. Within days, dental records positively identified the skull as belonging to Amber Tuccaro. According to investigators, the amount of time it would have taken to drive from Nisku to this location almost perfectly corresponded with Amber's 17-minute cell phone conversation. However, they believe that the discovery of her remains had nothing to do with the release of the audio, and that it was just pure coincidence that they were found only 4 days after the fact. Well, even though Amber's family could finally bring her home, they were still very unhappy with the original investigation. In 2014, Tootsie filed a complaint with the RCMP's Civil Review and Complaints Commission, expressing her dissatisfaction with how the Leduc RCMP handled her daughter's disappearance. Tootsie has since become a major advocate for the treatment of missing Indigenous persons in Canada, traveling the country in order to lobby for a federal inquiry into the issue. It would eventually turn out that Amber was not the only female victim of an unsolved crime in Leduc County, as a total of 5 murdered women, 4 of them Indigenous, were found within an 8-kilometer radius during one 13-year period. These other 4 victims were all involved in the sex trade and originally went missing from Edmonton. On September 22, 2002, Edna Bernard, a 28-year-old mother of 6 from Whitefish Lake First Nation, vanished after last being seen in a vehicle with unknown people. The following day, she was found in a farmer's field after having been strangled to death and her body set on fire. In May of 2003, Katie Sylvia Ballantyne, a 40-year-old mother of 4 from a Pasquawat Cree Nation, went missing before her remains were found in a farmer's field 3 months later. In May of 2004, Dolores Dawn Brower, a 32-year-old Métis woman, and 27-year-old Corey Ottenbright, the only non-Indigenous woman in this group, both went missing within 6 days of each other, but on April 19, 2015, the remains were discovered together on a rural property. This has led to speculation that Amber and these 4 other women may be the victims of a serial killer operating in the area. A year following the discovery of Amber's remains, 2 billboards were erected in Leduc County featuring Amber's name and photo, the address of the care website, and the words, "Have you heard the voice?" Well, since the recording from Amber's cell phone was publicly released, 3 women came forward who told the RCMP that they recognized the voice of the male driver, and they all named the same man. An RCMP investigator would later inform the media that after looking into this man, they had ruled him out as a person of interest. In September of 2016, the Government of Canada would finally establish the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls. After waiting 4 years for a response to her complaint, Tootsie Tuccaro would finally receive a 120-page report from the Civilian Review and Complaints Commission in September of 2018. It classified the Leduc RCMP's original investigation into Amber's disappearance as deficient and was particularly critical of their decision to remove her name from the missing persons list after only 1 month. At a press conference in which she read sections of the report, Tootsie stated, quote, "To the dirty bastard who's out there, we're not going away, and we'll keep searching until you're caught." End quote. But thus far, the murder of Amber Tuccaro continues to remain unsolved. So I guess you could say, the trail went cold. Now let's move on to our next case. Our second story begins in Alberta in 2011. Our second central figure is 36-year-old Jolene Cote, who lives with her 37-year-old husband, Mike Cote, and their 2 children, 6-year-old Aiden and 4-year-old Addison. The Cote family currently lives in Parkland County, just northeast of Spruce Grove, a town located over 30 kilometers west of Edmonton. They occupy a rustic 2-storied house which they had built the previous winter on a 1-acre parcel of land on Rural Route 264 next to a new subdivision of around 20 houses. Jolene has been working as a 9th grade teacher at Greystone Centennial Middle School for the past 3 years and also coaches basketball and golf. Jolene is very well liked within the community as she is known for going out of her way to connect with her students. One person would later describe Jolene as, quote-unquote, probably the nicest person who walked the earth, and say, quote, if you wanted to be like someone, it would be her. Jolene also has an avid interest in soccer, and on the evening of October 12th, she traveled to the Edmonton Soccer Center in order to play in a tournament with her team, the Spruce Grove Saints. Her husband Mike had originally planned to attend the game with their children, but decided against it because the game was going to run late, and their daughter, Addison, was feeling cranky. Mike told Jolene he would probably go to bed before she got home, but that she could go right ahead and wake him up if she felt like celebrating. After they won the game, Jolene had a celebratory cake with her teammates. She then proceeded to head home in her silver Jeep Liberty, but first decided to stop off at a Wal-Mart in West Edmonton in order to purchase some groceries and early Christmas presents for her children. Security footage would capture Jolene exiting the store at approximately 10:38 p.m., but this would turn out to be the last time she was confirmed to be alive. At around 6 a.m. on the morning of October 13th, Mike woke up and was surprised to discover that Jolene was not there and that his son and daughter were still in his bed. Mike and the 2 children had fallen asleep while he was reading to them the previous night, and Jolene would generally carry them back to their own beds before she went to sleep. Mike searched the house and could find no sign of Jolene, but it wasn't long before he looked outside and saw his wife's body lying on the grass. Mike immediately ran out to tend to Jolene and noticed that she had a gash on her head. He carried his wife's body into the house, wrapped a blanket around her, and put a towel over the gash on her head before calling 911 for help. However, after medical assistance arrived, Jolene was pronounced dead at the scene. The Spruce Grove Detachment of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police began their investigation, and while they made it clear that Jolene was the victim of a homicide, they have never released her exact cause of death. The items Jolene had purchased at Wal-Mart were still inside the back of her Jeep, lending credence to the idea that she was attacked immediately after she arrived home, placing her approximate time of death at around 11 p.m. Since Mike described Jolene's body as being very cold when he found her, she may have been lying outside for between 6 and 7 hours before she was discovered. Initially, it was reported that some of Jolene's jewelry, including her wedding and engagement rings, and a diamond pendant Mike had given her on their 10-year wedding anniversary, were missing, which suggested that robbery may have been a motive for her murder. But years later, investigators would say that Jolene was not actually wearing this jewelry at the time she was killed. They expressed their belief that Jolene's murder was a premeditated act and that she was not a random victim. On the day Jolene's funeral was held, Greystone Centennial Middle School completely shut down so that students and faculty could attend, and over 1,000 people were there to pay their respects. Mike Cote was described as being overwhelmed with grief and sobbed uncontrollably when he stood over Jolene's casket. Mike would be thoroughly investigated by the RCMP and interviewed multiple times, but he has never been named as a suspect or person of interest. In fact, no one has ever been publicly named as a potential suspect at all. Over the years, a small pond located near the Cote residence has been searched by police on 2 separate occasions, but they have declined to comment on what they were looking for. Ever since her death, the community has held an annual Jolene Cote soccer tournament in her memory in order to raise money for a reward fund and the youth charity Kidsport. This past year, Jolene's family commemorated the 7th anniversary of her murder by organizing a memorial walk from Greystone Centennial Middle School, and a number of her former students, who have since graduated and are now in their 20s, showed up to pay their respects. A $50,000 reward has been offered for information that leads to a conviction, but the RCMP continues to remain tight-lipped about many aspects of the investigation, and Jolene Cote's murder remains unsolved. So I guess you could say, the trail went cold. But before we continue, I would like to take a moment to recommend and play a promo for another podcast called The Secret Room. Hosted by Ben Ham, the gentleman you heard narrate the opening of this episode, The Secret Room is a very entertaining podcast in which every episode features an ordinary real-life person who has decided to appear on the show and share a pretty major hidden secret about their life, some of which can be pretty shocking. In fact, you can hear me join Ben on the recent April 16th episode of The Secret Room, where I make a brief cameo to confess a little secret of my own. Anyway, here's the promo.
What's the one thing you've never told anyone? I'm Ben Ham, and I host The Secret Room, a podcast about the stories no one ever tells. In each episode, a guest sits down to share an intimate story, a story that could touch you or amaze you, like Ashley did.
Hi, my name is Ashley, and my secret is I made a horrible wish about my brother, and it came true.
We explored Ashley's complicated family dynamic and the challenges a sister faces when the brother she loves dearly has severe addictions.
The nurses and the doctors, I kid you not, they said, he's a junkie, so this is what you expect.
And when Ashley reveals the secret she's been holding on to for a while,
a year and a half,
you may wonder about its consequences and if Ashley bears any blame for what happened next. Episode 79, My Horrible Wish That Came True. I'm Ben Ham. Welcome to The Secret Room.
Anyway, even though both of these crimes took place in rural Alberta just over a year apart, there's no indication that they were committed by the same person, as Amber Tuccaro was likely killed by a random perpetrator who gave her a ride, while Jolene Cote's murder does not seem random at all. But it is interesting to compare the backgrounds of the two victims. I mentioned earlier that Canada established the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls 2.5 years ago, because that is one of the biggest issues this country has ever had to face, and has even been described as a national human rights crisis. A disproportionate number of Indigenous females have gone missing or been murdered in Canada during the past several decades, but many of them have not received the adequate amount of attention from law enforcement and the media. In fact, there's a lot of dispute about the accuracy of the statistics in this area, as the RCMP once released a report in which they claimed that nearly 1,200 Indigenous women were murdered or went missing between 1980 and 2012, but many Indigenous women's groups believe that a lot of these crimes are grossly underreported and that the actual number of victims is over 4,000. It's a very unsettling issue which is far too complex to be explored on this one particular episode, which is why I'll recommend a podcast produced by the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation called Missing and Murdered. In case you haven't heard of it, at the time of this recording, they have released 2 multi-part seasons which chronicle an unsolved cold case involving an Indigenous female. Amber Tuccaro's disappearance can definitely be used as a model for how badly mishandled criminal investigations involving Indigenous women can be, and until the audio of her final cell phone recording was played at a press conference 2 years after the fact, her case barely got any media coverage at all. Now contrast this with Jolene Cote's case, which has been described by some as the quote-unquote soccer mom murder because she was literally returning home from a soccer tournament when she was killed. Jolene fits the profile of the type of victim who will generally get the most coverage from the media because she was a white, attractive housewife and mother, and it sounds like no one had a bad thing to say about her. But ironically enough, Jolene's case is relatively unknown outside of Canada, whereas Amber Tuccaro's murder has wound up getting quite a bit of discussion in true crime circles throughout North America, due in large part to the chilling audio of what may have been her final moments before she was killed. But regardless of their different backgrounds, Amber and Jolene both left behind children and families who have suffered immense grief and want justice for their murders. Now, one thing I will say about the Royal Canadian Mounted Police is that for the past decade or so, they have become very secretive when it comes to sharing information about unsolved crimes with the public, and will sometimes only release the bare minimum of details. This philosophy certainly applies to these two cases, as there are key pieces of information which have never been publicly revealed, and I'm sure you probably have quite a few questions about these crimes which I don't know the answer to. For example, we don't even know the exact cause of death for either Amber or Jolene. With Amber, it's possible they might not even know since she was skeletal remains by the time she was found, but with Jolene, they are certainly withholding how she died. So I'm going to analyze these cases the best I can with the information I have. Let's start off with Amber's story. We know that Amber, her 14-month-old son Jacob, and a female friend of hers left their home to fly to Edmonton. It's not entirely clear why they were traveling there, though I did find one source which said it was for a medical appointment. They stayed at a motel near the airport in Nisku in order to save money, but the thing with Nisku is that it's more of an industrial park than an actual town. While it's located right next to Edmonton International Airport, it's nearly 30 kilometers outside the actual city of Edmonton. Due to its close proximity to the airport, Nisku is filled with a number of hotels and businesses, but very few people live there as permanent residents, so it's mostly just frequented by travelers. One aspect of this story which has always left people confused is why Amber would decide to leave her friend and infant son together in their motel room in order to hitchhike to Edmonton. The only explanation I've ever read is that she wanted to go see another friend of hers. This is pure speculation on my part, but I've always wondered if Amber's trip had something to do with the fact that her brother Paul was incarcerated at the Edmonton Remand Center at that time. I don't know what exactly Paul was incarcerated for, but it should be mentioned that he's become a major advocate for his sister and is constantly trying to bring attention to her case, so he's definitely not locked up now. It's also possible that Amber just wanted to go into the city because she had gotten bored and antsy, as there really isn't a whole lot to do in Nisku. For many, the most difficult part to comprehend is why Amber would hitchhike, especially at night. I have covered quite a few cases on this podcast in which a victim went missing or was murdered while hitchhiking, but these generally took place during the 1970s or 80s when the dangers of hitchhiking were not as well known, so it might seem surprising that Amber would elect to do this in 2010. However, let's not forget that Amber grew up in Fort Chipewyan, which is located in a remote part of northeast Alberta. From what I've heard, hitchhiking is still a fairly common practice in communities like this because, quite simply, it's literally the only way for some of the residents to get around, especially if they can't afford their own vehicle. Given that Amber was trying to save money, she obviously did not want to shell out the funds for a 30-kilometer cab ride into the city, and if she grew up in an area where hitchhiking was just a way of life, she probably had no qualms about doing so. Sadly, when Amber did not return, the Leduc RCMP just gave her family the standard, "oh, she's probably just out partying" excuse to justify them not performing a proper investigation, which is a fairly common attitude whenever Indigenous women go missing. But this particular investigation hit an all-new level of incompetence when Amber's name was removed from the missing persons list simply because someone had supposedly seen her alive in Edmonton. Given what we know now, that sighting was obviously false, but for whatever reason, without even verifying that it was legitimate, they used it as justification to remove Amber's name from the list, and her mother had to go through a bureaucratic nightmare to get it put back on there. What I find particularly ridiculous is that the RCMP actually went so far as to destroy Amber's personal possessions, which were left behind in her motel room, even though it was potential evidence in an unsolved cold case. Of course, since Amber was murdered after she left the hotel, I doubt any of those items had much bearing on the investigation, but shouldn't it be standard practice to return a victim's personal belongings to their family rather than just destroying them? Some people might see this action as a sign of a cover-up, but I think it was just more indifference than anything else. Regardless, Amber's case would finally garner some national exposure in August of 2012, when audio from her final cell phone conversation was played for the public by investigators who asked anyone to come forward if they recognized the voice of the unidentified man in the recording. But there are a number of unanswered questions about how the decision to release this audio came about. It's unclear how long the authorities knew of this recording's existence, but it's actually pretty remarkable that it even exists in the first place. I don't know if I would use the word luck in regards to this case, but what are the odds that Paul Tuccaro would call his sister on her cell phone from jail while she was in a vehicle with a man who was about to kill her? The remand center Paul was calling from had only instituted a policy to record all outgoing calls a couple months beforehand, and if that hadn't occurred, this audio would not exist, and investigators probably would have had very little to go on. Amber's mother had always told her that if she ever caught a ride inside a vehicle being driven by someone who made her uncomfortable, her best strategy would be to stay on her cell phone, even if she had to pretend she was carrying on a conversation with someone. Since only 61 seconds of what was apparently a 17-minute recording have been released, we don't know the full context of what happened during Amber's final phone call. All we've heard are the sections in which Amber expresses concern when she notices that the driver is not heading towards Edmonton and seems to be taking her onto a remote back road. It sounds like Amber is following her mother's advice and making sure to stay on her cell phone the entire time she's inside the vehicle, but sadly, it does not sound like this strategy dissuaded the driver from harming her. Now, like I just mentioned, I'm not sure why the RCMP waited 2 full years before they decided to release this audio publicly. It's possible it took them a while to figure out this audio had even been recorded off of Paul's outgoing call from the remand center, but Amber's family seemed to think they had it in their possession for a while. I guess it might be because this was a pretty unprecedented thing in Canada, as the RCMP had never publicly released an audio recording related to a homicide investigation before, and it is pretty chilling to hear what may be the last moments of someone's life, as you can sense the fear growing in Amber's voice. If you're wondering why only 1 minute of the recording has ever been played, it's possible that the rest of it is mostly Amber conversing with her brother, and that these are the only excerpts featuring the driver's voice and clues that are relevant to the investigation. The last few seconds are muffled audio, and it sounds like Amber might be telling the driver to pull over before the call cuts off. If actual audio exists of Amber being attacked, then I can see how that might be too disturbing to release to the public. What's crazy is that Amber's skeletal remains were finally discovered only 4 days after the recording was released, but investigators seem to think there's no connection between the two events, and it's just a coincidence this occurred so soon after such a major development in the case. Part of me wonders if this was not a coincidence, and that perhaps the new coverage of the case prompted Amber's killer to panic and move her remains to another location where they were more easily found. However, the time it takes to drive from Nisku to this remote farmer's field almost perfectly corresponds with the length of Amber's cell phone recording, so I do think it's likely she was murdered almost immediately after the call ended and her body left at that spot. We're now going to move on to one of the most controversial aspects of this case, and that's the identification of the male voice in the recording. No fewer than 3 women have come forward to claim they recognize this voice, and they all name the same man, but the RCMP claimed they have ruled him out as a person of interest. Well, when the CBC news program, The National, did a segment about this case in 2015, they interviewed one of these women, who kept her identity anonymous, and she stated, quote, "I know that voice. I've ridden with that voice before on several occasions. There's no doubt in my mind that it's his voice." End quote. She seemed convinced that the RCMP did not look into this man hard enough. Well, if you search through any online discussions about this case, you'll find a lot of speculation about the identity of this man, and one person in particular keeps popping up. Since he has never been named publicly by law enforcement, I will not be using his name, but long story short, there are enough unsavory stories about this man that there is an entire blog and multiple Reddit threads dedicated to warning women about him. The man in question is a sex offender who has served multiple sentences in prison for various offenses and lives on a horse ranch near the town of Onaway, located over 60 kilometers northwest of Edmonton. This guy apparently has a history of using ads to lure women to work at his ranch, and there are numerous stories of him displaying creepy, inappropriate behavior. While law enforcement has never officially corroborated this, there are a lot of rumors that this is the man whose voice was recognized by the 3 women. If true, then this would mean the RCMP has already investigated him and ruled him out as a person of interest. From what I've read about the guy, he definitely sounds like a creep, and women are well advised to steer clear of him, but I'm not so sure he would be a likely candidate to be Amber's killer. Nisku is located about an hour from Onaway, so he would have driven far out of his way to pick up Amber, and it seems like his MO is to lure women to his ranch rather than actively going out to search for them. If he is not the man on the recording, then it is odd that 3 different women would identify him as the voice, but this could be a case of his reputation preceding him, and people believing he's capable of a crime like this. If police have ruled him out, then I can only hope they were very thorough at conclusively establishing that he could not have been responsible. So now we're going to explore the possibility that Amber was the victim of a serial killer, as she is one of 5 female victims whose remains were found in the same 8-kilometer radius in Leduc County. Well, I definitely have no trouble believing that there was a serial killer operating in that area. The thing which most points to this is the fact that 2 of these victims, Dolores Dawn Brower and Corey Ottenbright, both went missing within 6 days of each other in May of 2004, and their remains were found at the same location at the same time nearly 11 years later, so at the very least, those 2 murders have to be connected. One person who has been considered as a suspect in these crimes is Thomas Svekla, who is currently incarcerated for the 2006 murder of a sex worker named Teresa Innes, and was acquitted for the murder of an indigenous sex worker named Rachel Quinney, who was found dead in a wooded area outside of Edmonton in 2004. Of course, Svekla was already locked up by the time Amber was killed, but it would not surprise me at all if he is responsible for the murders of one or more of the other victims found in Leduc County. I'm just not sure if Amber's case is connected to these other crimes, because they all took place between 2002 and 2004. While the other women originally went missing from Edmonton, Amber vanished after hitching a ride a half-hour south from the city in Nisku. It might just be a coincidence that she wound up being killed in the same area where there was an epidemic of murdered sex workers being found. Honestly, I'm not even sure Amber's killer was someone who lived in the area. Like I mentioned earlier, Nisku is more of an industrial park than an actual town, and mostly exists to provide temporary lodgings for people leaving or arriving in the area via Edmonton International Airport. The man who picked up Amber could have been someone who was just passing through the area, and when he came across a young woman attempting to hitch a ride, he took advantage of the situation in order to harm her. I've seen some online sleuths express their belief that the accent of the man in the recording does not sound Canadian and more like it might originate from the Midwestern United States. If he does not live in Alberta, then this might explain why no one from the area has positively identified his voice. This would make the suspect a lot harder to catch, but the good news is that this case has started to become more well known outside of Canada, as it's featured on multiple true crime podcasts and YouTube channels, and the audio of the cell phone recording is easily available for listening on YouTube. Even if the killer lives outside Alberta, maybe one day, the right person will listen to the recording and recognize his voice, as this case seems very solvable. Anyway, before I bring this story to a complete close, let's talk about Jolene Cote's unsolved murder. This is another Canadian case where it's hard to figure out what might have happened because the RCMP has withheld a lot of key information and only released details to the public which they believe are absolutely necessary for them to hear. All we know is that Jolene Cote was murdered outside her residence one night and was found by her husband the following morning, but they have never released Jolene's exact cause of death, only that she had a gash on her head. Given that the items Jolene purchased at Wal-Mart were still inside her Jeep, it's reasonable to assume she was attacked immediately after she arrived home. Police seem certain that robbery was not the motive for this crime, and Jolene was not targeted at random. Before we go any further, we need to clarify 2 points of confusion in this case. In the earliest news accounts, it was reported that at approximately 6 a.m., authorities responded to a 911 call about a quote-unquote injured woman, but investigators would not disclose the identity of the person who made the call. However, in a later article published 2 years later, it was revealed that Mike Cote was the one who called 911 after finding his wife's body. It seems odd that the RCMP would decide to withhold this particular detail, so does this mean someone else called 911 right before Mike did? I mean, I guess it's possible that since this was first thing in the morning, someone might have passed by the Cote residence and seen Jolene's body outside and decided to call 911 only minutes before her husband found her. If there was a second 911 caller, I have my doubts it was Jolene's killer, since all indications are that she was killed immediately after arriving home at around 11 p.m., and it was between 6 and 7 hours before the authorities were notified. I think the simplest explanation is that Mike was the only person who called 911, and for whatever reason, authorities initially decided to withhold that information. The other piece of info in this story which has been a source of confusion is Jolene's jewelry. It was initially reported that her wedding ring, engagement ring, and a pendant her husband had given her were missing, which seemed to suggest that Jolene was the victim of a robbery. But years later, the RCMP reported that Jolene was not actually wearing her jewelry at the time she was killed, which is one of the reasons they do not believe robbery was the motive for this crime. Well, even though married people seldom take off their wedding rings, it actually makes sense that Jolene wouldn't be wearing it on this particular night because she was involved in a soccer tournament, and it's likely she wouldn't have been allowed to wear her jewelry while she was playing in the game. I also looked at the surveillance video of Jolene in Wal-Mart, but I don't think the footage is clear enough to determine if she's wearing a pendant around her neck. But even though investigators now say Jolene was not wearing her jewelry when she was killed, I'm not sure if this means it was actually accounted for. It was initially reported that the jewelry was missing, but does that mean Jolene simply left it at home that night and no one noticed for a while? This is one of those key details police have been very secretive about, and they probably have a reason for it. Another thing which is a bit ambiguous is how investigators feel about Jolene's husband, Mike Cote. He has never been named as a suspect or person of interest, but it doesn't sound like he was publicly cleared as a suspect either. I do know he was investigated very thoroughly by law enforcement, and if they found anything to incriminate him, they've been tight-lipped about it. Mike also had a very emotional breakdown at Jolene's funeral, which, assuming the whole thing wasn't just an act, showed that he seemed pretty devastated by his wife's murder. All that being said, I can see why some people might be inclined to lean towards the husband did it theory. Mike's story is that he fell asleep in his bed with his children before Jolene got home, and when he woke up the following morning, he found Jolene's body in the front yard. It's interesting how Mike moved Jolene's body into the house and wrapped her up in a blanket before he called 911. Of course, since Jolene was already dead by this point, this act likely contaminated the crime scene, but if Mike's innocent, there's no way you can fault him for panicking and moving his wife's body inside when he couldn't even be certain if she was still alive or not. But theoretically, if Mike killed Jolene, he could have staged a scene where he left her body outside on the front lawn all night before he quote-unquote woke up and discovered her, and if he made it look like he moved Jolene's body into the house in a state of panic, then he'd have an explanation if they found any of his DNA or physical evidence on her. It's worth noting that Mike was not present for the memorial walk Jolene's family held for her last year to commemorate the 7th anniversary of her murder, but I'm not sure if that really means anything. If police consider Mike to be a suspect, they've never publicly said so, and I've never heard anything about there being any problems in the marriage or him having a potential motive to kill Jolene. I do think that murdering your wife outside your house while your kids are at home and then sleeping in the same bed with them for the next several hours seems incredibly brazen. What if someone else had come across Jolene's body in the middle of the night and called the authorities before Mike woke up? So until I hear anything which specifically incriminates Mike, I have no reason to believe he's responsible. The Cote residence was located in a very rural area and fairly isolated from the other houses in the nearby subdivision, so it doesn't seem likely that someone would have just come across that place by chance while Jolene was parking her Jeep in the driveway. The most logical explanation is that someone followed Jolene home from the Wal-Mart and attacked her as soon as she exited her Jeep, though an alternate explanation is that she happened to come across someone on her property who was about to attempt a burglary on her house, but this person killed her and immediately fled the scene. But as far as I can tell, nothing was stolen, as the items she purchased from Walmart were still inside her Jeep, and when you look at the surveillance footage of Jolene exiting the store, you can see a lot of stuff inside her cart. The RCMP seemed convinced that whoever committed this crime did so with the specific intention of inflicting harm upon Jolene, which points to it being premeditated. The only other thing we know about the investigation is that 2 separate searches have been performed of a lake near the Cote residence. Police have never disclosed any details about this, but I think it's reasonable to assume they were looking for a murder weapon, as the fact that Jolene was found with a gash on her head suggests a violent death. But who could the perpetrator have been? By all accounts, Jolene was a universally well-liked person, and no potential persons of interest who might have had a motive to kill her have ever been named. In one interview, Mike Cote pushed forward the idea that perhaps one of Jolene's students or former students was responsible, but that's all just pure speculation, and we have no idea if any of her students seemed like promising suspects. With so much information being withheld from the public, I can't really come up with a concrete theory about what happened to Jolene, but it's certainly a very bizarre crime, and a pretty heartbreaking one, since she sounded like an amazing person whose loss completely devastated the community. At the very least, Jolene's family have been relentless advocates for her, and it's clear they will not stop until her killer is brought to justice. There's still a $50,000 reward for information leading to a conviction in this case, and the big break they might need is for someone to come forward. Anyway, I'm about to provide the contact info for anyone who might know something about the murders of Amber Tuccaro and Jolene Cote, but let's not forget there are 4 other murder victims mentioned on this episode who have also not received justice. Edna Bernard, Katie Sylvia Valentine, Corey Ottenbright, and Dolores Dawn Brower. Many of those women had children and families of their own who are still seeking answers about what happened. So if you happen to have information about the murders of any of the victims featured on today's episode, please call the Canadian Crime Stoppers Association at 1-800-222-8477. That's 1-800-222-8477. But if you just have your own thoughts about what happened in any of these cases, feel free to leave me a comment or send me an email to robin.warder@icloud.com. That's robin.warder@icloud.com. Now the reminder that The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so please visit patreon.com/thetrailwentcold to learn how you can support our podcast and become eligible for some pretty neat rewards. We've already produced a bunch of exclusive bonus episodes for our patrons in tiers 2 and 3, and last month, we released a new episode about a very unusual case of alleged amnesia. It covered the disappearance of a man named Lawrence Joseph Bader, who vanished without a trace, but resurfaced years later under a completely new identity, claiming to have no memory of his former life. We also recently implemented a new bonus reward for our patrons in Tier 3, in which I recorded my own audio commentary track to be played over the very first Robert Stack-hosted episode of Unsolved Mysteries. So to learn more information, feel free to visit our Patreon page. I'd also like to take a moment to thank our most recent listeners who have signed up to support us on Patreon this week, and they are Zarin E., Louise H., Rachel P., Harrison G., and Caroline C. Thank you all so much for your support. And you may have heard that for the third consecutive year, I will be representing The Trail Went Cold by appearing on Podcast Row at CrimeCon, being held at the Hilton Riverside Hotel in New Orleans in just a couple weeks from June 7th until the 9th. If you would like to purchase tickets to the event, but haven't already done so, we have our own personalized promo code you can use in order to get 10% off a standard badge. So to receive your 10% discount, please visit crimecon.com and enter the promo code COLD19. That's COLD19. In addition, I will also be appearing at another event, the True Crime Podcast Festival, being held at the Marriott Downtown Hotel in Chicago on July 13th. Since this is a Canadian-themed episode, I should also mention that I will be participating in a live show at the event alongside my friend Christy Lee of the Canadian True Crime Podcast. So to learn more information about this event and to purchase tickets, feel free to visit their website at tcpf2019.com. That's tcpf2019.com. Also, just wanted to give another shout out to my supporters at the Unsolved Mysteries message board at the Sitcoms Online forum and the Unresolved Mysteries subreddit. Need to provide a big thanks to McGill Foote, who edits and assembles this podcast together for me, and Vince Nitro, who composes the eerie music you hear on every episode. If you haven't already, you can like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, or leave us a rating or a review on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play Music, or Spotify. So have yourself a good week, and join me next Wednesday for another new episode of The Trail Went Cold.
Thank you.